Further ramblings of Railwaymen. Phil Bassett, 9 Elms Motive Power Depot. His journey from the ash pits to the boardroom. This is the second part of Phil's railway career and follows on from his engine cleaning days at 9 Elms. Phil has spent 2 weeks at firing school at Guildford and has passed his firing exam and is now about to start his apprenticeship, so to speak, with a diverse range of drivers and locomotives, but as there is a link structure in place, he will have to start at the bottom of the ladder, with his first firing turn being a disposal duty. Unlike myself starting my firing days at Guildford, where no one under the age of 18 worked nights, example between the hours of 10 p.m. and 6 a.m, 9 Elms men obviously didn't adhere to this ruling. Phil starting work at 9 p.m, working an 8-hour shift, finishing at 5 a.m. His driver that night was a Guildford man by the name of Vic Pratt, working on loan to 9 Elms. I fired to Vic on a number of occasions when booked along with him at Guildford, but I'll let Phil take up the story of his first firing turn.
It was Saturday. It was 9 o'clock at night, book on. After having the previous 6 months of day work, I was now booking on at 9 o'clock Saturday night, and I thought to myself, crumbs, that's what Dad wanted me to do. What a total shock to the system. Well, anyway, my first firing turn was what's known as disposal, which meant shoveling the fire out of the firebox on long steel-handled shovels. Some locomotives were lucky enough to be equipped with drop or rocking grates, but the older locomotives had fixed grates, and the only way that you could dispose of the clinker was to slice the fire over to one side, the good burning coals, which left the under-deposit clinker, which is the byproduct of combustion. All the impurities that were in the coal now formed themselves into a solid silica mass that rested on the grate. And if this solid mass, this clinker, got too thick, primary air, which is required for combustion to enter the fire from underneath, was prevented from doing so, and so the locomotive simply didn't boil. And so it was the disposal fireman's job at the end of a period, certain periods, trips or the day, to actually clean the fire, which was quite an arduous job because we were not given any protective clothing. We only had hand cloths, which we used to fold into a pad and use that to grip sometimes the glowing red-hot shaft of the clinker shovel, which in themselves could be 12 or 13 foot long with a 2-foot spade on the end, and then manhandle it out of the fire hole door, rotate it around 90 degrees and tip it out the side of the locomotive, and then manhandle the clinker shovel back into the fire hole door and carry on until you shoveled all of the clinker out of that half of the firebox. Then you had to slice and scoop over all the good burning coals that you previously put up on one side, put that over onto the grate area that you've now cleaned, and then clean out the clinker on the other side. If you were lucky enough to have a locomotive that had rocking or drop grates, you didn't have to shovel it out through the fire hole door. You actually broke the clinker up, and using an implement like a poker, which was called a dart, sometimes 10, 12 foot long, 1 inch thick solid steel shaft, you then broke the clinker up and pushed it through the openings in the fire grate. Now that was good because it saved you all that physical work, but you had to remember to make sure to open the ashpan hoppers before you put all this red hot clinker down into the ashpans. And it was quite common to actually have 18 inches of clinker in the firebox that you had to break up and shovel out through the fire hole door. And you've got to remember that depending on the firebox of the locomotive, certain locomotives had long, narrow fireboxes. certain Pacific style of locomotives had wide, short fireboxes, and so the fire irons that you had to use had to be commensurate to the length of the firebox. And the Lord Nelson class had sometimes a 14-foot firebox, so you had to have a clinker shovel of 16 foot in length. And whilst you're manipulating the clinker shovel back out through the fire hole door, to actually get the shovel mouth clear of the fire hole door, the handle of the clinker shovel is hitting the back of the cab, and so you had to be quite dexterous, and you look like a tightrope walker with a long pole trying to balance it whilst you're manipulating this clinker shovel, turning it 90 degrees to drop the red hot clinker outside the locomotive. And that was hazardous, because if somebody was walking past at the time, it was quite often that you'd be dropping a shovelful of red hot on top of them. And so as you was walking around a motive power depot where preparation and disposal was taking place, it was a dangerous place to be unless you were aware of the safety elements that were involved. Well, of course, the actual fire iron itself would glow red hot, and as you were not given any protective clothing, only what they used to call sponge cloths, you would fold these into a pad and rest the hot clinker shovel shaft on this pad, and you would then slide your hand up and down the shaft with this pad protecting you. You could buy leather gloves from the army surplus stores, but sometimes these leather gloves, due to their continued exposure to these red-hot shafts, they themselves would actually get too hot for you to actually wear, and after a while the leather used to crack and break, and you would end up with a gaping hole in the palm of the hand, and so you had to use a sponge cloth anyway. And so for dexterity and ease of touch, we used to use cloths all the time. Now, once I'd done my stint as a preparation and disposal fireman, and it used to go by the colloquial term as Billy Shit, because that's what it was. You was just the Billy in the shit all the time. I then progressed on to the empty carriage link, and that was working of empty coaching stock between Clapham Junction and Waterloo and vice versa, with small tank locomotives. And you was often booked with a driver who, for one reason or other, old age, discipline, physical problems, had come off of the main line and had decided to be a driver on the empty carriage gangs. And these old boys, they were a clique unto themselves. Well, anyway, the old driver that I was booked with in the tank gang was a guy called Jack Webb, Spider Webb. He was in his mid-60s, 63, 64, no teeth, right old boy, always moaning, always grumbling, and he used to call me his fire boy. I wasn't a fireman, I was a fire boy. I was a 17-year-old fire boy. And old Jack Webb used to get me to clean fires and do other such things. And I remember one day we were in Waterloo North Sidings, taking water, where another old tank gang driver, a guy called Crunden, I've forgotten his Christian name, but we used to know him as SS Crunden, and he had a fireman, a fella named Keith. Well, old Crunden's engine was not steaming, and he was moaning that the ash pans were dirty, and Keats wouldn't clean the ash pans out. With the cheek of it, old Jack Webb said to me, I'll get my fire boy to do that for you, and I was told to lay down in the track with an ashpan rake at my side. Crunden then moved the tank engine over me, and then at the right place I had to sit up and rake out the ashpan, sitting on the track in a funny position with my bottom half and legs stretched out, but me sitting upright, with the ashpan rake, raking the ashpan out, while Keatsy, Crunden and old Jack Webb are standing at the side there saying what a good job I'm doing. And I thought to myself, why are they watching me? Well, that's life. You got on and done it because you wanted to build up a reputation as being a good fireman. Because of the rapid promotion, a lot of the elder drivers were taking retirement, and that meant that there was younger drivers being promoted, And likewise, all of the firemen that were of an age to take their driving exam went forward for their driving exam. And so people like me, as young firemen, there was rapid promotion. And at 18 years of age, I was lucky enough to be promoted up into the running gangs. The running gangs. The short road passenger gangs, where we were allowed to work the stopping passenger trains 48.5 miles to Basingstoke. What a thrill that was. We also had one turn to Salisbury in our link, 84 miles to Salisbury. What a privilege it was to work the 0440 hours paper train to Salisbury. And then years later we realised why that turn was in our gang and not the top link. Who would want to book on at 3:30 in the morning to work the 0440 paper train to Salisbury? But the back working was to come up with the 0630 Exeter, and that was a business train. It only had one stop en route, Andover, London. And that was a nice job. We would often have a merchant navy with 10 on coming up from Exmouth Junction shed, and we would relieve the Exmouth men at Salisbury, and the cheeky buggers, the firemen were in their late 50s. And they would be looking round and saying, well, where's the fireman then? Are you the cleaner boy out third manning? And we say, no, I'm the fireman. And they used to look down at us to think, what are you doing, you young whippersnappers? And that was the difference between London and the west of England. Down the west of England, there was very slow promotional prospects. And so it was quite common practice to have a guy in his mid-50s as a top link fireman. Well, because of the rapid promotion, I was lucky enough to move into the top link. And in 1964, I was appointed a top link fireman at 9 Elms. And in the top link, we only had 8 pair of men. And my regular mate was a guy called George Lloyd. He was a very meticulous man, very knowledgeable of a locomotive, kept himself to himself, and allowed me the privilege of driving. And that was wonderful to actually think that here I was, a young man in my early 20s, late teens, early 20s, being allowed to drive a crack mainline express. And I have to think that it was very reminiscent of fighter pilots in the Second World War. 20-year-olds being put in charge of such valuable and dangerous machines. And there I was, a young man on the regulator of a merchant navy on a West of England express. And I can only thank the ability of George Lloyd to skill me, to guide me, to allow me to have such responsibility in his name. And with that element of trust that was built up between a driver and a fireman, so you had a very harmonious working relationship. Although we had the 8-hour day and the 44-hour week, if you were preparing your own engine to go away on an express trip, you didn't think anything of coming in half an hour early to make sure that your engine was prepared, because you were preparing it for your own use, and so you were only making your job that easier and easier to accomplish if you took that little bit extra time and effort in preparing the locomotive at leisurely pace rather than the bare 1 hour that you were rostered to perform the task. And so it was a case of self-help. And self-help was also one of the underlying trends for promotion to driver, because there was no formal training in those days to become a driver. You took your driving exam where you was examined by the traction inspector of your knowledge of rules, regulations, safety procedures, boiler management, management of the locomotive. But you had to acquire those skills yourself. And so being a fireman was seen as a part of an apprenticeship for the young fireman to actually amass all of the knowledge that will allow him to take his driving exam and be qualified to drive a steam locomotive. There was no formal training as such. There were mutual improvement classes, where, as the name said, mutual improvement. senior drivers and interested firemen would congregate together, and there were management provided facilities, training aids, etc. But it was left to you, the individual, to acquire the knowledge to satisfy the traction inspector to take your driving exam. And I can say I was so proud when I passed my driving exam. For rules and regulations, the inspector who took me was a guy called George Reynolds. And he said to me, "You're going to pass, aren't you?" I said, "I know I'm going to pass, George." And at the end of the exam, he told me afterwards, he said he really gave me a good, strong exam because he wanted to test the depth of my knowledge. And he said he was quite impressed and he would put it on my driving certificate. And I can only think that that endorsement recognised to others that I did have the ability to progress. And that's one of the things that I've been very grateful for this railway industry, that it's allowed promotion on ability. If you had the ability, the industry would allow you to nurture and develop those skills and to apply them to the betterment of the railway industry and, of course, to your own advancement. I was lucky enough to be able to be booked with experienced drivers, guys that knew of my keenness to do the job, and they shared with me all of the understandings that would be required for my driving exam. In the meantime to that, of course, Nine Elms Motive Power Depot closed. And in 1967, we were all moved to Waterloo, where Waterloo Mixed Traction Depot evolved. There was no regular pairing of drivers and firemen. I was what's known as a past second man, and I was in a large link of second men that would be used on the various jobs, turns that required the provision of a second man. But as I was lucky enough to having passed my driving exam, to enable me to gain driving experience, I had to pass a route knowledge test to determine my depth of knowledge over certain sections of line. And I used to sign for all of the obscure routes that other drivers would not have the knowledge of, knowing full well that I would then be utilised on driving turns. Quite often I was quite happy to be a driver on the heavy freights that used to work from Southampton docks up to Temple Mills in London, because I was confident to sign the route on what's called the North London lines, where a lot of passenger drivers were not confident to sign the route on. And so that gave me an exposure to driving at a very early point in my driving career. When I passed my driving exam, I then went forward. I then undertook training courses, because with the dieselisation electrification programme, there were structured training conversion courses for drivers. Although the basic knowledge for rules and regulations was not structured until 1976, these conversion to diesel or electric traction was structured training. And the southern region had a very good network of driver training centres. In the 1971, I went forward on an electrification where I learned electric locos, diesel locos, etc. as a driver. Again, I was inquiring. I used to ask questions, and if I found something out, I used to go to the local traction inspector and ask him, what does this mean? What does that mean? And I was very lucky in my railway career that people realised that I was an individual that wanted to learn, and they used to tell me what I wanted to know. And in 1973, 74, I was approached to see whether I wished to become an acting instructor in the Southside training schools. And I remember the date, 28th of April 1974. Yeah, 73 or 74, can't remember which year. But another driver, a chap called Colin Marshall, we bumped into each other as our first day as acting traction inspectors at Southside Training School at Waterloo. Colin was a driver from Horsham. I think Colin was 10 years older than me at the time. I was a driver at Waterloo, and we were going forward in a new branch of our career. And that was an eye-opener. As being a practical exponent of the task of train driving, I had to learn it all over again. I had to go back to basics and learn the philosophy of the rules and regulations and procedures that we were being asked to teach. And that was one of the real enjoyment periods in my life. But having an inquiring mind, I could now ask questions and understand why something was being done in a particular way. And the head of driver training was a chap called Reg White. He himself being an ex-driver from the Central Division at Stewart's Lane. He, in his early years, had been an instructor in the training schools, teaching the electric traction that has been installed in 1957 on the Kent Coast electrification, and before that on the Central Division, because it must not be forgotten that the Southern region had electrification in 1936 on the Brighton lines. And so it had a well-established driver training organisation. And Reg White was, if you like a football scout. He would go around the region identifying people that could be developed into good inspectors, instructors. And I was lucky enough at 24, 25 years of age to be selected to go forward as one of the new breed of traction inspectors. And I have to say, I did get a degree of resentment from some of my colleagues at Waterloo, because they used to call me a fly-by-night, a whippersnapper. You've got no experience under your belt. How can you be qualified to teach others when you haven't done it yourself? But I thought, well, that's funny. I've done steam, I've done electric, I've done diesel, I'm now in the school. If I've got the ability to learn and communicate that knowledge to others, it's not necessarily age and seniority, it should be ability and suitability. And so, although I was brought up under the seniority progression organisation, I have to say I always sympathised with ability to allow promotion, with the knowledge to support that. The pupils, the students, were across the spectrum. It was new entrants under the MP12 organisation, where there was no fireman as such, and secondmen had to go through what was called the traction trainee training period, where they were given the understanding, very similar to this training I had as a fireman at firing school when I was in transition between cleaner and fireman. But this time it was an understanding of diesel locomotive operation, an understanding of electric traction, the application of rules and operating procedures before an individual could become a second man. Likewise, under the MP12, there was training for second men who then were going forward in their driving career. And that was a 6-week structured training package. But as an instructor, not only did I have to have a full and thorough grasp of the subjects that I was teaching, I had to go on a self-development course which was called Methods of Instruction. And that was to skill me in the communication of the subject matter that I was now possessing. And that was a very enlightening course. That was a 4-week course at Faverdale Hall up in Darlington. A residential course where we were taught all of the interactive and communicative skills. And some of the people that I met on my Faverdale Methods of Instruction course, we kept in contact with throughout my railway career, because there were new instructors from Ilford Training School, from Euston Training School, from the King's Cross Training School. All of British Railways in the London area at the time was going through a revision of its driver training, and so it had to have skilled instructors to communicate that. One of the most daunting training courses that I actually took as an instructor was a class of drivers who were converting to the new Class 50 locomotive, diesel electric locomotive, that was being drafted in to work the West of England expresses. And I had 6 drivers on the conversion course to Class 50s. And those 6 drivers were guys that I was a fireman to in my early days at 9 Elms. And one of the drivers was my old regular mate, George Lloyd. And so George Lloyd, Jack Blanchard, Jim Robinson, I can't remember all of them, but George Lloyd was sitting at the front of the class and they were all looking at me as if to say, right, Bassett, teach me. And that was the most daunting first hour introduction to the Class 50 that I ever held. And when we broke for the mid-morning break, George Lloyd stood up and he said, Phil, he said, I speak for all of us here. We're here as the students, you're the instructor, and you know more than us, and we're here to learn. And I said, George, thank you for that vote of confidence. But I have to say that was the most daunting training course I'd ever started. And I was lucky enough because, again, I wanted thirst for knowledge. All of us in the training school at Southside prided ourselves on our depth of knowledge. And our understanding had to be examined by the Chief Mechanical and Electrical Engineers Department. It wasn't sufficient to know how a locomotive worked. You had to satisfy chartered engineers that you knew how the locomotive worked. So any new traction that came along, as well as creating your own lesson notes for training, you had to know how it worked, and that meant study of electrical schematic. So you knew what happened from the moment the battery switch was closed. It was engineers training. There is no other word for it. I learned how to read an electrical schematic. I knew all about electrical circuit design, and I had to prove that knowledge to chartered chief engineers of the region. And I remember that when I learnt the Class 50s, I had to go forward to the Western Region chief electrical engineer by the name of Michael Etwell at Paddington to be examined on my depth of knowledge of the Class 50s. Whilst I was undergoing my CM&E examination on the Class 50s, I brought it to Mr. Etwell's attention that when these locomotives had gone through a major overhaul, Swindon Works had installed some isolating cocks the wrong way round. I have to say, Mr. Etwell looked at me as if to say, what are you telling me about my engines? And I took him onto a locomotive and I proved to him that the bogie isolating cocks were actually installed the wrong way round. And Mike Etwell looked at me in sheer disbelief that a traction inspector could identify that his chief engineers had failed to do. Another name that comes to the past was Alec Bath. Alec was the regional chief operating manager in 1977 of the Southern region. And I remember the date sticks out on the 5th of September 1978. I'm having my lunch in the Southside mess room at Waterloo Training School, and I noticed that trains were beginning to build up on the approach to the station. And as we were all traction inspectors, we went outside and decided to see what was going on. And we saw that their train had become derailed at the throat of Waterloo Platform 14. And we rang up the box and said, can we be of assistance? And Jack Callahan, who was the area manager at Waterloo at the time, was out at the area, and he said, yes, he said, we're going to have the current off and we would like to detrain these trains and walk the passengers in. So we went back into the training school, we got all of the drivers that were there under training, and we got them out to act as wardens to assist in herding the passengers that had been detrained from these trains. And I was given 2 trains further back along the line at Lambeth Road Bridge, which is the outer home signals to Waterloo, to detrain 2 12-car trains and have the passengers walk in along the side of the track to Waterloo. And whilst I'm arranging for the detrainment, I've told the drivers and guards of each train what's going to happen, and they carried out the detrainment purposes. And I'm just walking through the train, a 12-coach train up from Portsmouth Harbour, when all of a sudden I heard the motor generator set start up. Now, knowing that the only way that can start up is if the conductor rail has been alive and energised. And I had a fright. I thought, oh my God, there's going to be death. And I ran to the back of the train, into the driving cab, got out what's called the short circuiting bars and applied them to the track, hopefully to discharge the conductor rail to prevent injury. We had a public inquiry chaired by Major Peter Olver of the Railway Inspectorate, where I was asked to recount my involvement, and I'm pleased to say that that's the only time I've been mentioned in dispatches in the HMRI report, that through my prompt action I was able to prevent further injury taking place. And Alec Bath decided that he'd better show some recognition, and I was taken to lunch in the senior officers' mess at Waterloo. Another should we say, recognition factor. Back in 1971, when I was a second man at Waterloo and I had knowledge of the boilers on the warship locomotives, we had the state visit of the Emperor of Japan. And that was quite a privilege to be involved in the Royal Trains working these state visits. I remember one day we were down at Gatwick Airport ready to take the Emperor up to London, and we were going up what's known as the quarry lines. And as we exited Red Hill Tunnel on the quarry lines, there were some factories along the side of the line, and there were men in their wartime uniform with all their medals on, giving V signs to the trains, shaking their fists. So they must have had some fond memories of being a prisoner of war of the Nippon Empire. And another strange event was, as we were going through Brixton at Shepherd's Lane Junction, there was an emergency speed restriction, and detonators had been applied in accordance with rules and regulations to warn the driver of the speed restriction. And when we exploded these detonators, the radio has come alive in the front cab from the police control on the train saying, "Is that gunfire? Is that gunfire?" As they thought that somebody might try and shoot the good old Emperor. Another state trip I had, I was lucky enough to be involved in, of course, was with the King of Afghanistan. And, you know, we think that then he was the king, and here we are in 2002, and the King of Afghanistan is still there, but slightly older than what he was in 1971 when he had his state visit. Again, that was a very enjoyable period of time. I was 32 years of age. I was appointed a Grade E traction inspector, one of the youngest Grade E traction inspectors there was, involved in special train operation, testing of new locomotives, new methods of working, as well as being a senior instructor within the organisation. And in 1979, I saw a job advertised on the Midland region, MS1, management grades, first class travel. And so I looked at the job description and I put in an application for the job. And all those around me said, boy, you will never get that job. Not only is it on a different region, it's on an AC region. What do you know about AC traction? Well, I'd done my homework. When I was at Faverdale Hall having my methods of instruction course, one of the co-pupils on the course was an AC loco instructor. And I dug out all of his lesson notes from those early days and read them. I also rang him up. He was at Rosegrove up in Manchester, and I rang him up and I said, do you remember me? I'm Phil Bassett. Yes, he said, I remember you, you big-headed bugger. I said, well, tell me all about AC locos. And he told me. And I went for the interview, and I had a wonderful interview. I know I had a wonderful interview. They couldn't shut me up. And one of the questions was, I'll never forget it, how does an AC loco work? And I said, what do you want? He said, tell me what you know. And after I only just got past the pantograph, he said, enough's enough, stop. Well, to cut a long story short, I came back from Crewe where the interview was held, and I was elated. I had a good interview. But I also knew that a lot of people were also up for interview. Well, the previous occupant of the post that I was seeking had now moved to Ilf. And so I rang this guy up, Len Muir. And I said, Len, can you tell me about this Carlo Street job that you just moved away from? And Len was saying, it's a very difficult job. You're dealing with loads of different types of traction. Well, anyway, Christmas comes, and I've not heard a thing. And I'm booked this morning to take a driver on his exam on the 9 o'clock West of England service. And I'm in the office at Southside School at Waterloo, and I've got a phone call that I was to go over and see Reg White immediately. So I got my bag, my briefcase, straight over to Waterloo. I was up in Reg White's office at 8:30, and he said, thank God you're here. He said, Alan Ing wants to see you. I said, what about? What's happened? He said, I don't know. He said, Alan Ing's secretary just wants to speak to you immediately. So I said, well, I'm down on the 9 o'clock West of England. Oh, he said, don't worry, I will get somebody else to cover that. Well, I thought, no, I wanted to go down West of England because sometimes, of course, as being a good instructor, you like to have a little drive yourself. And that was one of the beauties of being a senior traction inspector. You chose when you drove trains, not when the roster told you to. Well, anyway, I was escorted along to Alan Ing's office, and Alan Ing was a wonderful man because during my firing career at 9 Elms on the top link, George Lloyd knew Alan Ing when he was in lower engineering positions. And as 9 Elms was the last main line of steam, we had a lot of the Continental Railway engineers coming over to have a ride on the footplate. And I had as our guests Alan Ing and his guests many a time. And I remember one early day Alan Ing saying to me, Phil, what's your ambition? I said, your job, sir, motive power officer. Well, 20 years later, I got there, Dennis. But unfortunately, Alan Ing died before he saw that, but summoned me to his office, and there he is, Chief Mechanical Electrical Engineer for the Southern Region. Big office, big desk, secretaries running around, and I'm standing like the naughty schoolboy in front of him. He said, Phil, he said, I've just had Eric Pointer on the phone. And Eric Pointer was the motive power officer of the London Midland region. He said, they want to offer you the job at Carlo Street. I said, does that mean I've got the MS1? MS1, he said. Do you realise you've gone from a driver to a manager in less years than I was a fitter's apprentice? Consider yourself lucky. Leaned across the table and give me the biggest handshake and hug. He said, don't forget, you're a southern man of heart. You go and tell them Midland region guys what it's all about.